Welcome back to the Science of Happier Work. My name's Jackson Curtis. I'm a partner at Happiness Means Business. And in today's podcast, we're going to talk about some of the surprising business outcomes associated with happiness and well-being. And so we're kind of giving you an overview of the business imperative around this work of applying the science of happiness and human flourishing to organizations to drive operational outcomes. And now, in one of the past podcasts, we covered the surprising connection between happiness and success. And we did talk a little bit about how that affects the personal level, both personally and professionally, kind of level of individuals, but also on up to the level of the organization. So we'll touch on a little bit of that same research, but we'll really tease out some case studies and primarily research literature explaining how happiness and well-being in employees affects things like sales performance, overall job performance and productivity, as well as even things like safety and compliance. So let's get into it. We'll just go through a lot of the literature here, kind of fast pace, and I'll include some information of this as well below, some references and whatnot in the caption of this podcast. So, as I've said before, generally speaking, what the positive psychology literature finds is that happier people are more creative, more engaged, and more effective. And then this ultimately sort of trickles up, so to speak, into the level of organizations where organizations with higher levels of engagement and well-being tend to perform better than their peers. So let's start at some of the outcomes that may be associated with differences in happiness and well-being. And we'll start with revenue or sales. So a landmark study that looked at this came from Dr. Marty Seligman, who's kind of a pioneer in positive psychology. And in the 80s, or I think it was the late 80s, he did a study with MetLife. Now, this is a massive insurance company that hired about 5,000 insurance people every single year. And they did something interesting is he designed a test, and that test focused on optimism. Now, optimism is essentially, if you think about past, present, and future, and you can kind of almost have happiness in each of those dimensions. And sort of like happiness or positive emotion associated with the future, associated with prospection. So we tend to be optimistic if we think about the future in a way that's pretty positive and we believe in ourselves and believe that the future will be better. And of course, this closely ties to happiness and state of mind. So they hired these salespeople, and he had this optimism positivity test that they'd put people through. And then they looked and they would see, okay, people who scored with a certain level of positivity and optimism, and then how did they perform in their careers in sales? What they found is people that passed the test, right, that hit a certain benchmark of optimism and positivity, outperformed by 8% in the first year. Okay, not crazy, but pretty good. In the second year, they outperformed people who didn't kind of pass the optimism test by 31%. Now that is incredible. And he went on to find that people who scored really, really high in the optimism kind of test, even if they struggled or didn't pass the company's aptitude tests, which is more about your skills and technical knowledge, they still tended to outperform the people who are a little bit more pessimistic and less happy. And then he went on to apply this research to several other industries, and it's now pretty established. But pretty incredible to think that maybe in 1 to 2 years, differences in baseline levels of optimism, of kind of happiness, positivity, thinking about how people view the future can make someone 30% more effective, 30% increase in revenue on a per person basis. That's pretty incredible. There was an additional study to support this. I just did a quick review of the literature, like I said, that was published in Frontiers of Psychology titled, Are Happy People More Productive? Or Are Happy Workers More Productive? Excuse me. And they looked at this in banking with something called cross-selling. So now cross-selling is when a representative at that bank sells another one of the bank's services, which thus increases revenue per customer and overall revenue for the bank. And they looked at 492 people in this study. And they found that happiness at work predicted effectiveness of cross-selling. So once again, you see that people who are happier in their work, higher levels of well-being, tend to sell more, and that increases revenue pretty directly. So let's kind of extend this revenue and financial piece here to a final study, and then we'll get more into other elements of performance. This one comes from IBM and Globoforce. This was a study they did looking at how employee experience, which again, you have to paint with a little bit of a broad brush when you're looking at this research, because some researchers are going to talk about optimism. Some are going to talk about employee well-being. Some are going to talk about what's called employee engagement, which is a term defined by Gallup that tends to basically represent how engaged one is in their work, right? So how enthusiastic and interested they are. But then you have others that might talk about happiness. And then in this case, employee experience, which is kind of the overall quality of life, so to speak, of that worker. So now all these things have slightly different nuances, but for our purposes, I think we can all, broadly speaking, categorize them under this idea of happiness and work. So anyway, you have IBM and Globoforce. And what they found, they did a survey and series of studies with a ton of different companies. And what they found was they looked first at employee experience, right? So that's kind of like, how satisfied are you with your overall experience working for this company? What they found is that those in the top 25% had 3 times the return on assets and 2 times the return on sales. So return on assets, of course, basically measuring how effectively the organization is deploying capital, both tangible assets, technological assets, and human capital. Right? What is kind of the ROI they're generating on that? And then return on sales is really a measure of how efficiently and effectively sales dollars are being converted into profit. So you can imagine a company that spends a ton of money on advertising, pays their salespeople a ton of money. They burn through a lot of leads, and they do generate a lot of revenue, but the profit margin on that revenue could be very bad. So in this case, we see 3 times the return on assets and 2 times the return on sales, which is pretty incredible. So now let's drill a little bit deeper here into performance, and we'll step away a little bit from the financial side and just talk a little bit more broadly about performance, productivity, service levels, etc. So first, you have the study that we've referenced before on this podcast, but I just think it's incredible, is called Happy Soldiers Are Higher Performing. This was again done by Seligman and his colleagues at the University of Pennsylvania. They looked at over 100,000 members of the U.S. Army, and they looked at 3 different things. So first, they looked at optimism again, right, which is kind of your emotional tone associated with how you think or see the future. Positive affect, which is more present moment. How do you tend to be? Like, what's your emotional set point? Is it more positive? Or negative affect, which is the third thing, right? So you tend to be more positive or more negative, generally speaking. And then what they found, of course, they looked at this over a period of years, and they found that people who had higher levels of positive affect and optimism were far more likely to win awards for performance and heroism, right? Or courage or bravery. So in the military context, that's your Purple Hearts, your Medal of Honor, etc. So pretty incredible to think that these military men and women who tend to just be happier, right, for whatever reason, are going to be more likely to show courage, more likely to do acts of bravery and sacrifice, and ultimately perform at a higher level, which gets them recognized with these awards. So continuing on back to maybe more of the traditional professional setting, we have Thomas Wright at Kansas State, who's done some research on this. And in one literature review, he talked about how happiness and well-being of employees can become a competitive advantage, because what he said he saw from kind of the surveying the research is that about 10 to 25% of variance in job performance is accounted for in differences in happiness and well-being. Right. So what that means is that, maybe up to a quarter of the difference between, 2 employees of what separates a really good one from a really bad one is going to have to do with their level of happiness and well-being. A further study, this one comes from Oxford's Syed Research Business School. I don't know if I'm saying that correctly. It's SAI with a couple dots over it. D is the name of that school. They looked at a large telecommunications company that had a lot of telemarketers. And they would try to map. This study was interesting because it wasn't like a one-time survey. It was more frequently checking in with their, not only kind of their mood, right? So on any given day, how happy were they feeling? And so they even brought in some correlations, interestingly, with how the weather could affect performance. Because as you might imagine, in the UK, if it's very gray, rainy, kind of cold, ugly day, you're a little more, but if it's beautiful and sunny, maybe you're a little bit more excited. And so they looked at this, and what did they find? Well, looking at thousands of employees over many, many days, so a huge sample size here, they found that the happier workers were, in fact, more productive. And they were more productive in two ways. They didn't actually work more time, but they completed more calls per hour. So they had higher levels of compliance with their schedule, higher levels of productivity in terms of just output. And in those calls, they had higher levels of conversions to sales. So it's almost like they were putting forth more effort, they were more engaged, they were sticking to the schedule more closely, and then they were also more effective in converting the sales, which ultimately in this case is productivity because that's their role. The final piece that is a little bit more sector specific is a connection here for those folks in healthcare. So I'm looking at a visual here that basically shows a straight line down and to the right when you're looking at kind of the relationship between caregiver mental health um, and patient outcomes. And so this study, the reference here is from the last names are pretty tough. Poor caregiver mental health predicts mortality of patients with neurodegenerative diseases. So in this study, they looked at patients who had neurodegenerative diseases. So often these were going to be life-ending. They were terminal diseases. And they tried to look at how the mental health of caregivers affected the patient outcomes. So what they find is that worse mental health in caregivers influences the quality of care they provide. So for example, depressed caregivers are more likely to engage in patient neglect or even patient abuse. Caregiver mental health problems weaken the social bond between patients and caregivers, and low quality relationship functioning has been linked to poorer physical health, impaired immune functioning, and increased likelihood of mortality. So what we see here is that through several factors, these researchers cite emotional contagion, which is how emotions are transmitted from person to person, and even behavioral mimicry, that worse mental health in caregivers, negatively influences patient outcomes. So why is that important? Well, of course, there's an ethical dimension because we are in healthcare and hospitals and we want our patients to recover and be healthy and live longer. But also from an operational perspective, you have here potential for higher readmission rates, which are often very costly to hospitals. You have, again, longer stays with maybe more expensive procedure and upkeep and problems. But then finally, large, and for a lot of you listening to this, you may not know this, but it's kind of an interesting factoid of economics. For many hospitals, the primary way they get funding is through a MCAP score, which is essentially a subset of patients who stay at the hospital, get a survey from the CMS, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid, and they're asked, hey, what would you rate your experience at the hospital? And based on the overall score, kind of the net promoter score for that hospital, determines their funding level that they get from the government. So thinking about healthcare sectors here, that the people that you are serving, your patients, and the insurers, in a sense, and the government subsidies, if you have lower levels of mental health and well-being amongst your employees, In caregivers, that's going to result in worse patient experiences and patient health outcomes, which is ultimately going to hinder the performance of the organization quite dramatically. So that one starts to get a little bit of kind of getting into our next piece here, which is the final piece I'll touch on, is safety and compliance. Now, one piece of this that also affects hospitals and healthcare is quite dramatically because call-ins, which are kind of absenteeism or last minute people calling off work, are very prevalent, but true as well in a lot of manufacturing settings, et cetera, that these things can be very costly and very problematic. Well, we have a study here from Hoxie, published in the Canadian Public Administration, that found that more engaged employees were less sick and used less sick time. So again, it's not directly happiness, but kind of engagement levels of, I enjoy my experience of work, I feel pretty interested, I feel pretty good about it, tended to use less sick time. Now, he does point out that this is not necessarily a very strong correlation, and there were some other factors, so probably some further research to be done on that point. But there's further research that kind of supports this, and this comes from Weziak-Bialowolski and VanderWeele from Harvard University, and they published a paper that talks about psychological climate of caring. So they use the acronym PCC, which kind of gets at, do people feel cared for and connected in their work psychologically, right? So you get some element of happiness and well-being there. And in a big study they did, they found that organizations with higher levels of PCC, that psychological climate of caring, had employees were less distracted and they were more engaged and productive. And so you had less deviation from the schedule, less being off of task, and overall higher levels of effectiveness and compliance as well. So we're starting to see, right, that there's the financial implications fairly directly. We talked about return on assets, return on sales. We talked about revenue from increased sales performance. Then we talked about service level and performance in a few different contexts, right? So general productivity, again, kind of marketing productivity, soldiers in terms of their service levels and bravery. And then we've talked a little bit here about a little bit more nuanced around absenteeism and some healthcare applications. And a final one we'll talk about is safety. And so we have less maybe literature on this, and we're more going to speak to a couple case study we did. But first, there is one study that is rather interesting for this. So they brought people into the laboratory and they primed them with positive or negative emotions. So what that means is you're basically getting like these images flashed up in front of you, that some of them are maybe really positive or happy and others are kind of dark or sad. And they put those people into two groups. So the people who are primed for positive and the people who are primed for kind of negative. And then they did a series of visual tests where they'd flash things on the screen and they'd flash things on the periphery. And people were kind of meant to assess how well they picked things up in their visual field. And what was really interesting is that people who were primed for more positive emotion had actually more expansive vision. They could literally see more and perceive more than their negatively primed counterparts. So now you can imagine in safety context, we work with the US Army as well. So combat professionals, right? If you're clearing a room or you're a sniper, having that peripheral vision. This one client we work with is trucking. So you can imagine, again, you're on the road and you have things coming at you from the sides or a car pulling out in front of you, et cetera. So there's one study at least that kind of makes a biological connection between happiness and a more expansive visual field, which ultimately is going to help you be more aware of your environment and be much safer. Now, speaking from practical experience here, we had an engagement with the nation's largest produce hauler. Now, they brought us in because they were about to become uninsurable. So even though they do like $500 million in revenue a year, what they were struggling with is they had so many insurance claims, it was going to be too expensive to insure them. So we came in, and as we do, we started by really focusing on the psychological climate and honestly happiness and well-being. So we started thinking like, how can we create a culture and organizational dynamics that improve things like happiness and well-being, ultimately engagement, and even social connection, especially between members of management and the frontline staff. And so we worked with them for 6 months or so, really focusing on developing their leaders to create these ideal psychological conditions where people felt there was a connection and they could really communicate with one another. People felt engaged, and they felt like they were buying in to a culture of safety. So all of these things that maybe even aren't specifically happiness, but again, the psychological dimensions of the workforce we're talking about here. And kind of to make a long story short, since the last season, it's a very seasonal business, we've cut their cost of claims by about 80%. And why is that? Well, we see that employees tend to be more engaged and they're a little bit more energized with that. And then finally, they have this kind of culture where they have more authentic relationships. And so they're better able to communicate, address unsafe behaviors, and actually follow through and comply with things, because instead of some jerk being like, oh, you got to go do this, it's like, oh no, I actually respect and want to communicate in an emotionally intelligent manner with my manager. And so again, all of these things that were kind of related to happiness and well-being can be leveraged with a slightly different spin to drive more concrete or more tangible operational outcomes. The final model I'll share with you here is something that you can do a little research on if you're interested, but it's called the service profit chain. Now, this is a theory that starts to tie together some of what we talked about here, which are kind of the results, to the actual mechanisms of how does this kind of work, right? How is it that employee well-being and happiness ultimately does lead to better business performance, right? We have some examples of it, but this theory kind of gets at some of the mechanisms. And now, this comes from researchers at Harvard University. I'm trying to pull up the reference in front of me. I don't have their names. I believe the last name is Sasser. But what we see, or what they propose, I should say, is that you begin with kind of this connection, right? This chain that they call it. So you can picture one of the first squares is employee satisfaction, which I would broaden, say employee satisfaction and employee well-being, right? And then this connects to two other things: employee retention and employee productivity. So when people are happier, they tend to remain in their jobs, right? So you have less retention, less turnover. And that sort of aligns as well with employee productivity, right? Because when people feel good, they have more positive emotion, they're well and happy, they're more creative, they're more engaged, they're more effective, they're more energized, they have better interactions, etc. And so these two kind of go together. And the retention piece is also important because it means you're retaining talent and institutional knowledge. One of the most underrated long-term negative consequences, in my opinion, when we're thinking about strategy of kind of low levels of employee happiness, low levels of employee satisfaction, and high levels of turnover, is the loss of institutional knowledge, which refers to these kind of knowledge of how to actually do things and get things done that are hard to capture in the formal systems and business technologies in most organizations. A lot of how work gets done effectively and how to do things is kind of this qualitative, kind of informal knowledge that exists within your employees. So you have employee satisfaction, which feeds into retention and productivity. And then that leads to external service value. And what that means is that they either design better products for customers, or better services, or overall better customer experiences. Right? So you can think if you were selling products, you'd probably be focused on product and experience. But since you have these, you've retained better talent and they're more productive, they're going to craft better products and they're going to create better experiences around those products. Or consequently, if you do a service-based business, you're going to provide a higher level of service. And in those client-facing engagements, probably going to provide a higher level of customer experience as well. What does that lead to? Well, that leads to increased customer satisfaction. That leads to increased customer loyalty, which increased customer loyalty is increasing the customer lifetime value. And that finally leads to revenue growth and increased profitability. So you can start to see how we went from examples to mechanisms here. I'll walk through it a final time. Employee satisfaction. So your well-being strategy, right? How well are you crafting a culture and an environment where employees can flourish, right? So employee satisfaction and happiness leads to improved retention and productivity, which leads to improved external service value or product value, in either case, which leads to more satisfied customers, which means more loyal customers, which means they increase customer lifetime value and referrals, which means more revenue growth and more profitability. And that is, in summary, the service profit chain that, again, was kind of published. I have the reference in front of me now by, in this case, Haskett, Jones, Loveman, Earl, Sasser, and Schlesinger are some of the names associated with this paper, at least. And I believe they're the people behind the chain. If I'm misattributing that, I'll, of course, correct it. But that's a final, again, kind of theoretical underpinning to better understand how this works. So we've covered a lot in this podcast. This was a little bit more research heavy. They're not always this way. A lot of times we talk more about tactics, tools, and firsthand experience. But I think as someone interested as a business leader or just a professional in general, it's really important to understand that we have this kind of interest in bringing the science of well-being, happiness, and human flourishing into the world of work and organizations, not simply because it's like some great, nice thing to do and we should all be happy. We all should be happy. But I believe, especially as you think about 21st century leadership and the competitive landscape of the future, that organizations who can cultivate happiness and well-being for their people to flourish are going to have a distinct competitive advantage in the 21st century. So I hope you enjoyed this wide-ranging discussion of some of the literature of how kind of surprising in some cases, maybe even how happiness and well-being can drive operational outcomes, things like sales, things like overall performance, things like service level, things like return on assets and return on sales, and even things like safety and compliance and absenteeism. All of these are affected by some of the psychological levers we talked about around engagement, well-being, experience, happiness, etc. So that's all for now. This has been Jackson Kirchis with Happiness Means Business, and I will talk to you soon.